If you're familiar with my channel, you know that I usually reveal the subversive nature in films that are pumping propaganda into the soft little minds of the audience, and while in some ways this video is no different, in fact it probably has the most effective propaganda in terms of compelling the audience to action than any other film I'm aware of, but I hesitate to call it a subversive film. This film, when I first saw it, I was working for a large computer company that had grown way too big, way too fast, and the baby boomers in management, in classic boomer capitalist fashion, became so blinded with greed, despite record profits, they decided to put all their focus and energy on enriching themselves and the shareholders at the expense of the employees and the customers who had made the growth happen in the first place. This would eventually lead to that company imploding in on itself, but not before they hired efficiency experts to come in and try to squeeze every penny of profit out of their employees by tracking every second of their time, literally every second, and their customers by nickeling and diming them for services that used to be free. The working conditions became so unbearable that many of the best and brightest left the company. And in an effort to stave off the brain drain that had begun in response to these efficiency experts, the company instituted carefully timed and condescending corporate team building activities like pizza parties and movie lunches, like an elementary school teacher would for their classroom if they would just behave. It was during one of these movie luncheons that my manager made a fatal mistake. She brought us into the conference room and we gathered around the TV and we watched this film we're about to talk about. The very next day, completely independent of each other, 3 of the most senior employees didn't show up for work, never called in, and were never seen or heard from again. I was one of these employees. In that movie, if you haven't guessed already, is the 1999 film by Mike Judge, Office Space. I've actually spoken to several people who have their own variation of this story after watching the film. In fact, the lead actor was interviewed about the film recently, about Office Space becoming kind of a cult classic, and he remarked that to this day, people come up to him on a regular basis to tell him that they quit their job immediately after seeing this film.
People will come up to me from time to time and say, you know, this movie and you were the reason that I quit my job and walked away from my livelihood.
Changing jobs is one of the most stressful things a man can do, yet this film, after telling a story for 90 minutes, has motivated countless Americans to do exactly that. And not just quit, but in many cases just stop showing up for work completely. So what made this film so powerful? What was it about Office Space that could account for this phenomenon? Well, it's because it told the truth. It told the truth about corporate America, but also the truth about an aspect of white men that makes many people who write films uncomfortable. You see, Office Space wasn't written by people that typically write films in Hollywood. It was written and directed by Mike Judge, a white male who didn't come from Hollywood or money and had worked in the real world before. He understood white men better than most of Hollywood, and an aspect of their behavior that's relevant today. Lately, I've heard people say the phrase, and I've said it myself, that white men are nice until they're not. Now, to some people, that sounds like maybe a passive-aggressive threat, but it's not. It's descriptive of how many white men process conflict. Some people, when they attempt to describe this behavior, will conjure up the image of a kid getting bullied and bullied and bullied until one day he snaps. They make it seem as if this kid, who obviously is a metaphor for the white man, is like a canister of volatile material that's just getting shaken and shaken until the pressure builds up and it explodes. But this totally misunderstands the process. Office Space walks us through the real steps of what's going on in the minds of white men when faced with conflict. It acknowledges that the extreme reaction to the outside danger isn't something that slowly develops. It's not the product of pressure being applied over time that makes their solution to the conflict more and more extreme as the pressure builds up until they snap. But instead, if you really understand the process, you understand that the initial solution in the minds of these men is extreme. And there is no snap. There is simply a slow erosion of the self-control that's containing that initial instinct to deliver a devastating response. The initial extreme solution is rarely acted upon because it's typically so extreme, so severe, that given time to rationally weigh the consequences of carrying it out and assessing the collateral damage, the rational mind often concludes that enduring the problem and tolerating the danger seems safer than executing the extreme solution. From the very start of the conflict, that is the equation. These men will table what seems like an extreme solution to a problem in the hopes that the problem will resolve itself, or that a less extreme solution presents itself later, and they will delay until the stress generated by the conflict or the problem or the perceived danger outweighs the perceived or predicted collateral damage that might come with being assertive and taking the extreme action that they have in mind. I think a lot of you know what I'm talking about, but if this seems confusing, it'll make more sense as we walk through the film, because this is at the very heart of the film. It's white men faced with conflict who come up immediately with extreme but effective methods of resolving the conflict, but wait until they can no longer justify waiting or sense that danger might be imminent, and then they enact these extreme solutions. So let's dive in. The movie starts out immediately developing the ultimate problem or the conflict that the main character has, the dehumanizing conditions that existed for people unlucky enough to work in an office job in the 90s that was micromanaged by profit-centric boomers. The first challenge of this way of life is, of course, being stuck in traffic, with countless other office workers going to their various office spaces, changing lanes and then watching the lane you were just in begin to move and then changing back only to have the traffic inexplicably stop for no reason. From the very beginning of your day, it's just frustration after frustration. We're introduced to Peter, the protagonist, and briefly some of his co-workers. Next, we see an establishing shot of the office space in question, a place called Initech, a buzzwordy generic name typical of the countless tech companies that sprang into existence in the 90s. Peter's boomer boss, Bill Lumbergh, has made sure, of course, that he has a reserved parking spot and he drives a Porsche. The massive wealth inequality that we see today is something that's been in the making for a long time. And this was kind of the beginnings of some of that. We see the inane modern corporate art that adorns the outside of many of these office buildings. And while I'm not positive if it was intentional, it's interesting to note that it's a square peg that is being put through a round hole, which is exactly what it felt like to work in many of these one-size-fits-all type of corporations. Peter, wearing his security badge and business-appropriate shirt and tie, starts his day dreading opening the doors to the office, thanks to the static electric shock he receives when he touches the handle. He works in a drab, bland, gray room of cubicles that looks identical to many of the offices in the 90s, including the office where I worked. It literally looked exactly like this room. Each cubicle is like a little gray prison cell that features all the negative aspects of being surrounded by walls, with none of the benefits. Benefits like blocking out the voices of everyone else around you, or stopping your boss, Bill Lumbergh, from just dropping in. Bill tells Peter that he forgot to include a cover sheet on his TPS report, and we easily infer from the context that whatever that means and whatever a TPS report is, it's clearly some mundane micromanagement busy work that's likely completely pointless. After that, we meet Milton. Milton is the first and clear-cut example of the extreme problem resolution strategy that we discussed earlier. Also, many people don't know this, but Milton is modeled after a cartoon character that inspired the entire movie in the first place. Milton is also, because in some ways he's the main character, even though the film doesn't seem to be really focused on him, he is close to encountering his conflict and generating this initial extreme resolution to the problem. But first, Peter now encounters another boomer boss, Dom, who berates him about the same TPS reports, followed by a phone call about the exact same reports. This is highlighting the source of the real inefficiencies that existed in these offices. All too often, micromanagement was a weapon wielded by the boomers who, despite a complete lack of tech skills, were managing these tech workers. So what they would do, and I saw this in real life at several different companies, they would have to justify their existence and their salary, which was usually twice that of their workers. And so what they would do is they would just micromanage the hell out of everything and just add as much paperwork and unnecessary steps to justify their existence and make it look as though they were doing something. And at Initech, it's no different. We now meet Samir, a H-1B visa holder, back when there were so few of them, we could still kind of have a sense of humor about it, and back when our culture was still dominant, so we could make fun of the cultural differences without anyone losing their minds. One of those differences is happening right now. It's important to note that Samir is reacting differently than the white characters do to conflict. Instead of coming up with an extreme, elaborate, oftentimes solution to be acted upon later when all other options have run out. When this printer, for example, has a paper jam, or when he's driving to work, he reacts instantly with anger and violence. This is part of the honesty of the film. This violent reaction is the joke. And it's funny because it's true. It's believable. His reaction is foreign to the wider culture. We also meet Michael, who's also frustrated with his job and hates that his name is Michael Bolton because he hates the singer, Michael Bolton. Peter, Samir, and Michael go to a chain restaurant called Chotsky's to get some coffee. The chain restaurant is the unbearable workplace for wage-slaving corporate Gen Xers of the blue-collar variety. The environment might seem different than the office at Initech, but as we'll see, it's just as dehumanizing and micromanaged by the same kinds of people. This is where Peter reveals the theme of the movie. Everything we've been discussing about extreme responses to problems. One of the first things that happens after being introduced to the characters is Peter, the main character, jokes that his solution to his problems at Initech might be just coming into work and shooting up the place. Obviously, this is a joke, but this is what I mean by white men come up with an extreme solution first. He didn't slowly build up to this solution. His initial reaction to the bad day that he's having is to shoot the place up. Now, obviously, the risks heavily outweigh the benefits, so there's no chance he'll act on this extreme solution, but it's the first one that came to mind. His rational mind then assessed it as ridiculous, so he laughs it off and continues to endure the problem rather than act on this extreme thought. But it doesn't change the fact that he had the thought. That was his first reaction. And that's what we'll see again and again and again in the film. The three office workers complain about their work, and this is where we're introduced to Michael's extreme solution to the problem that he's having in Initech. He mentions that he could program a virus that would rip the place off. But just like Peter, the rational part of his mind sees this as way too risky a response given his current situation, so it's simply repressed until conditions change. We also briefly see a young Jennifer Aniston who plays the the waitress named Joanna that Peter has a crush on but is afraid to approach. We also learn that Peter has a girlfriend who is likely cheating on him and who wants him to see a hypnotherapist to help him get out of his rut. The three run into Tom, and Tom essentially sets up the major conflict of the film. He's another white guy who later deals with problems with extreme solutions. He tells them that efficiency experts are coming in to streamline the office, and he's afraid they're all going to get laid off. At the end of the day, Peter comes home, and we see the typical shitty 90s apartment. After working all day in your cubicle prison cell, you go home to your IKEA-furnished apartment prison cell, clumped together just as closely as the cubicles at your office. Peter's neighbor, Lawrence, who can hear everything that goes on in his apartment through the wall, is a blue-collar worker, the kind of guy that the popular culture likes to present as uneducated, uncouth, and dirty. You don't want to do jobs like Lawrence. That's for people like him. Although in a few years, those jobs will go to hordes of illegal immigrants. This is where Peter talks about his problems with his job, and he reveals his extreme solution to the problem. It's to simply stop participating, to stop consenting to being micromanaged. The next day, the efficiency experts have arrived with a huge banner that reads, "Is this good for the company?" All the employees are gathered around Bill Lumbergh to listen to his condescending corporate pep talk about not wasting Post-it notes and working extra hours for free. Next, we see Milton, and now Milton reveals his extreme solution to his problem, Bill Lumbergh, pushing him around. He tells Peter on the phone, who is completely ignoring him, that he is going to burn the building to the ground. That's Milton's initial extreme response to the stress he's under. If he reaches a certain threshold where he perceives the consequences of burning the building to the ground as having less of a negative impact on him than the humiliation that he suffers at the hands of Bill Lumbergh, he will execute this initial extreme response. Again, this is not a situation where Milton is slowly pushed off the edge and then he snaps and then decides to burn the building to the ground. His starting point is burning the building to the ground, and he will exercise all the restraint that he has to keep from executing this solution until, of course, certain conditions are met and that solution seems reasonable. Bill Lumbergh catches Peter before he can sneak out for the weekend and tells him that he needs to work both Saturday and Sunday. This was something that Peter was trying to avoid because he wanted to go fishing. Dejected and depressed, he accepts these orders from Bill Lumbergh and then goes with his girlfriend to see the occupational hypnotherapist later that night. The therapist begins to hypnotize Peter. He tells Peter to forget his worries, his cares, his inhibitions. But before he can move on beyond that, he drops dead of a heart attack. Peter is now stuck in a state of hypnosis. In a way, he no longer has the ability to assess the risks of acting upon these initial extreme solutions to different situations. In a sense, Peter's brain has been hacked and relieved of this process. He will now just act immediately on his first impulse when faced with problems. So the next morning he wakes up, and instead of going to work, he listens to his first impulse to just go back to bed. He also ignores the several phone calls when Bill Lumbergh starts calling him to see where he's at because his initial response is to just not answer the phone. When he does finally get up, it's 3 p.m. His girlfriend calls and she's complaining to him for missing work and acting strange. So his first solution that he comes up with in his brain is to just hang up on her. And that's what he does. This, of course, causes her to break up with him, but he doesn't care. He just goes back to bed, where he stays for the rest of the weekend. Monday morning comes around and they're having another soul-crushing corporate ethics meeting on how to save money for the company at Initech. Peter is nowhere to be found because instead of going to work, his first impulse was to go next door to Chotsky's and ask out the waitress he had a crush on. While that's going on, Tom and Michael are forced to defend their jobs in front of the new efficiency consultants. Back at Chotsky's, Joanna and Peter seem to hit it off. The idea, of course, is that Peter is just being really direct and unflinchingly confident, and women find that attractive because he's no longer tied up weighing the risks and consequences of every little thing that he does, and he's just simply acting on his first impulse, unapologetically. He's taken on the traits of an alpha. This is another important aspect of the film. It explains with simplicity something that connected on a really deep level with several young men who would watch this and then later model this behavior in their own lives. Peter says very matter-of-factly, "I don't like my job, and I don't think I'm going to go anymore." Joanna seems surprised and asks, doesn't he think he'll get fired? And she says it in a way that really illustrates the ever-present paranoia of Gen Xers working pointless jobs, living paycheck to paycheck with no savings. They took the humiliation for one reason and one reason alone, the fear of being fired and unable to pay this growing stack of bills. Peter responds, "I don't know, but I really don't like it, and I'm not going to go anymore." "So you're going to quit?" she asks. "Not really. I'm just going to stop going." Joanna is shocked and says, "Well, how are you going to pay your bills?" To which Peter replies, "You know what? I don't really like paying bills either. I think I'm going to stop doing that too." Joanna is so impressed with his presence that they make a date for that night. Now we go back to Milton, who, remember, is the character that the film is based on. He has decided that his solution to burn the building to the ground is not yet appropriate. However, one of the boxes in favor of burning the building to the ground gets checked off when Lumbergh comes and takes his favorite stapler. Now that Peter has Joanna's phone number, he comes into the office to get his address book, something that probably seems weird because everyone now has an iPhone. Michael is shocked to see him because he's been gone for 2 days and just walked in at noon wearing casual clothes. He tells Peter that he's supposed to be meeting with the consultants. Peter thinks this actually sounds kind of fun, so he walks into the conference room where they're waiting and he behaves the exact same way he did with Joanna. Instead of seeking their approval or constantly calculating and trying to say the right thing or what he thinks they might want to hear, he just confidently tells them the truth. He tells them that he sneaks in late to work all the time. He spaces out at his desk and in any given week really only accomplishes about 15 minutes of real work. Once again, we see the power of being straightforward, of being an alpha. The consultants respond positively to this straightforward approach as he tells them why nobody cares about their jobs at Initech and why they work just hard enough to not get fired. Which, by the way, as someone who worked at a company very similar to Initech, I can tell you that's precisely what managing a business like that produced. It produced people that did essentially just the bare minimum, just enough work to where they wouldn't get fired. So Peter describes this phenomenon to the consultants, and then he excuses himself from the meeting and ignores Lumbergh on his way out. We now go to Joanna's demeaning workplace, and her manager complains that she only has the minimum amount of buttons on her uniform that the regulations call for. He suggests that she express herself and use more buttons than the minimum required number of 15 buttons. He mimics the corporate mind games that management would often play on their employees. He wants her to wear more buttons, but instead of just telling her, wear more buttons, he wants her to make the choice to wear more buttons. He can't just raise the minimum. He has to make her think that it's her idea, but at the same time shame her if she doesn't have the idea. This is a bizarre management tactic that I often saw in the 90s. You would be shamed for only meeting the minimum requirements of the pointless rules, like the number of buttons on your vest, but your only reward for exceeding these pointless guidelines was the absence of being constantly shamed. These big corporate workplaces were completely dehumanizing and cult-like, no matter where you worked, whether it was in an office or at a chain restaurant. Back at Initech, the consultants tell Lumbergh they need to lay off Tom. They also inform him that Milton was actually already laid off 5 years ago, but has still been receiving checks through a glitch, so they just fixed the glitch. They have no plans to tell Milton that he's been laid off. They're just going to let the problem work itself out. The scene is comedic because, like most of the comedy in this film, it's just brutally honest. The complete lack of human compassion they have for the workers is obvious. Lumbergh largely agrees with the consultants, and things only get awkward when the consultants tell Lumbergh they actually like Peter and want to give him a promotion. This is followed by a montage of Peter behaving completely without fear of consequences at the office. He parks in Bill Lumbergh's reserved parking spot. He unscrews the doorknob that shocks him every morning. He tears down the corporate propaganda banners. He cleans a fish at his desk and takes the walls off of his cubicle. Because of his alpha behavior with the consultants, he's immune from interference from management, who now kind of are afraid of him. That's another truth this film reveals. The raw power that just being honest and assertive has. So many people, intelligent people, make the mistake of thinking that the way to success is through constantly plotting and manipulating, and don't understand the power of just being unflinchingly honest. It doesn't just attract women. Because it's a characteristic of a true alpha, it changes your relationship with men too. Men don't like other men that are always plotting and scheming because, quite frankly, it's kind of feminine behavior. A man's man is someone who's honest and confident, not cocky, but sure of themselves. And this movie does a great job of showing the difference in how people respond to Peter the Beta and Peter the Alpha, as well as showing that he didn't really change who he was. He just stopped letting the fear of consequences change his behavior. Now we go back to Milton. He's no longer receiving paychecks, and Lumbergh plans to just keep making his life uncomfortable until he stops coming in because he's too much of a corporate coward to actually fire him. Milton, of course, is getting closer and closer to executing his extreme plans. Next, the consultants tell Peter that they're going to lay off Samir and Michael and replace them with entry-level people that'll work for nothing and outsourced overseas labor. This movie is 20 years old, but the current crisis in the workplace has been brewing for a long, long time. I mean, simply because the way the capitalist system is structured, you're always going to end up with sociopaths at the top who only care about the bottom line. That's just simply the way it is. Peter doesn't like this, so he tells Michael that Initech is going to lay him off. And just like that, the conditions have now been met for the extreme solution that Michael came up with at the very beginning of the movie. There is a virus that they can install that will slowly siphon money from each transaction their banking software makes, and it'll eventually, after years, earn them lots of money. Peter, Michael, and Samir install the virus on the mainframe, and the extreme solution to their problem has been sent into motion. To celebrate the execution of this extreme solution, the three are now feeling reckless and execute another extreme solution by executing the printer that kept jamming on them. And now we get to Tom's extreme solution in response to getting laid off. He tries to commit suicide to get insurance money for his wife, but then his wife finds him in the garage trying to gas himself. Tom decides to change his mind, but is instantly hit by a drunk driver. He survives and wins a big settlement and throws a party. On the way to the party, Peter tells Joanna about their plan, and she disapproves because it's stealing. Also, while at the party, Tom's lawyer makes Samir and Michael extremely nervous by talking about prison. This is when Peter's friend Drew tells him that Joanna used to date and has had sex with Lumbergh. This sparks a fight, and the two break up. The next day, Peter nearly has a heart attack when he checks the account balance on the account they set up for the virus to siphon money into. After one day, it has over $300,000 in it when there really should be closer to $3 or maybe $300. Peter tells Michael and Samir, and they close the account before it can get any bigger, but now they have to figure out what to do about this. The company will certainly notice that kind of money missing from their accounts. Once again, Milton is pushed even closer to his extreme solution when he's the only one to not get a piece of cake at Bill Lumbergh's birthday party, and they move his office into the basement. After thinking about what he got his friends into, Peter decides once again to do the alpha thing and to take responsibility for the heist gone wrong. He decides to return the money and take all the blame. He tells Joanna and makes up with her and finds out that it was actually a totally different Bill Lumbergh that she was dating. And then he leaves the money along with the confession note under the real Bill Lumbergh's door. Peter is ready to accept his fate. He's ready to face the music, but then something unexpected happens. When Peter goes into the office the next morning, the building is on fire. Milton has finally executed his extreme solution to his problem. The solution that he didn't slowly form over time, but the solution he came up with immediately. His initial solution that he placed on the back burner as he searched for another way out. But Milton, having exhausted all of his other options, eventually he was able to justify taking his extreme action and burning the building to the ground. Just like Michael, whose initial solution was to write a virus, he eventually got to a point where the unreasonable seemed reasonable. This is the way these men think. This is how they process conflict. When faced with a problem, their initial thought is an extreme and thorough solution. And it's only the restraint of these men that prevents this solution from being carried out. And if the problem isn't resolved, that restraint, little by little, gets undermined. It forms cracks like a dam until one day, that restraint is no longer strong enough to prevent the extreme from being acted upon. With the building burning down, Peter realizes that the evidence is gone. Through this twist of fate, he is now off the hook. And of course, because this is a comedy, essentially everyone lives happily ever after. In the last few moments of the film, we discover that Michael and Samir go get jobs at another tech company. But Peter has learned a valuable lesson. He has learned that his quality of life is more important than the status of having your own cubicle. He no longer wants to be a cog in the huge global machine, a cog that the globalist bosses view as a tool, subject to arbitrary rules to be replaced on a whim when the globalists think that it might make them more money. Peter decides he'd rather just work in construction than deal with that. The sad irony, of course, is that in real life, the globalists will do the same thing to the construction industry that they did with everything else. They just slowly replaced the working class, skilled American tradesmen with cheap illegal immigrant labor, all so that they can enrich themselves at the expense of the American worker. In the last scene, we discover that Milton must have found Peter's envelope full of money before he burned down Initech and is now living it up on a beach somewhere. However, he's unhappy with the service, and once again, his mind goes straight to an extreme solution. The solution that he mumbles to himself to the bad service at the resort is to put strychnine in the guacamole. And the audience is left to imagine whether or not Milton's dam will burst once again, if his restraint will be undermined. The movie is a comedy, and the ending is a bit formulaic and somewhat of a joke. Nobody just lives happily ever after in real life. But I can tell you one thing. After watching this film, I never again worked in a cubicle or memorized a mission statement or met with an efficiency consultant. This film made me understand the humiliating reality of being a corporate America beta cuck and prevented me from ever again becoming a wage slave for the Bill Lumberghs of the world, and taught me the value of understanding your instincts, understanding that the mind comes up with solutions almost immediately, and the only reason people don't act immediately is the fear of consequences. But if you're honest and forthright with your intentions and you have nothing to hide, people will respect you And eventually, you will learn to trust your instincts, and most importantly, respect yourself. For BlackPilled, I'm Devin Stack. If you like my videos, make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you share because the algorithm is going to push this to the bottom of the stack. If you want to support my videos, you can grab a copy of my book, Day of the Rope. Link is in the description, or you can go to my Patreon at patreon.com/BlackPilled, subscribestar.com/BlackPilled, or donate to the crypto addresses below.